Good morning. Welcome back to our study in the Gospel of John. Today we continue in chapter 6. We have looked at the feeding of the 5,000, that central miracle in the chiastic structure of the 7 signs, the Semea, and we've observed that each of the key, the beginning, the center, the feeding of the 5,000, the wedding at Cana, and the cross, which is the mirror of the wedding at Cana, all three are Eucharistic in nature and with definite reference to the blood of Jesus. I believe I mentioned early on that this gospel is perhaps the most sacramental of gospels, and what is going to occur here in chapter 6 should be absolutely unnerving and unsettling for all of us, because there is an invitation that's going to be extended in this chapter that's absolutely abhorrent. And your reaction to that, from the Johannine writer's perspective, determines the outcome of your destiny, in a sense. Okay? So we're going to look at chapter 6. And there's a couple of things I do want to observe about this before we launch into kind of a look-see at this. I want to reference one major work here. It was published in 1964. It's a dissertation, Peter Borgen's dissertation. He has gone on in his lifetime to become an absolutely incredible Johannine scholar, and has done tremendous work in Philo and the rabbinic tradition and the Gospel of John. Everything he writes is excellent. And what Borgen notes is that the discourse that's going to occur beginning in verse 25 and going down through, I believe it's the end of 58 or so, is exactly the style, the homiletic style, the sermon style one would find in an ancient synagogue. And he shows that from the Palestinian Midrashim and also from Philo of Alexandria. So this chapter has an intentional structure to it, okay? And you'll notice that it's preached in a synagogue. The next day, the crowds on either side, beginning around verse 22, see Jesus, they follow him. It says, and when they they couldn't find him, so they crossed to Capernaum to look for him, and they found him. They said, Rabbi, when did you come here? Okay. And then down in verse 59, it's, he taught this doctrine at Capernaum in the synagogue. So this whole thing is bracketed with these references to the Capernaum synagogue. And it would make sense that the writer would use a homiletic style that he was familiar with to create this discourse. Now, this is the only sacramental discourse in the entire New Testament. You have Paul's little reflections in 1 Corinthians 11, okay? And you can obviously glean certain things from the redaction of the synoptic writers and the Eucharistic narrative of the Last Supper. Each of them has their own little take. But this is the only sustained narrative on the sacraments in the New Testament. I mean, you have references to baptism. First Peter does a little bit of exploring a theology of baptism, as does Paul in Romans 6, but you don't have any sustained discourse like you do here. So this is central to the gospel. It's the discourse directly related to the sign that will create the impression in the crowd Jesus is a Davidic warrior-type Messiah, a Deus ex machina, if he's in the Greco-Roman sense, Davidic warrior Messiah in the Second Temple Jewish eschatological sense. Either way, what you have is the crowd seeing this and Jesus recognizing that his fate is sealed. And we've noticed, of course, in the Johannine narrative and in the synoptic narratives, there are several things that converge here. The accusations of breaking Torah, the themes around bread, and the feeding of the 5,000. Okay, So that's the two things you want to keep in mind. If you go to a library, you can probably find Peter Borgen's dissertation if you're really interested. There's another book I am going to reference, and I will include it in the OP when I get there. And doggone if I didn't no, there it is. It's Esther Kobel's book, Dining with John, Community Meals and Identity Formation in the Fourth Gospel. And I'll be referencing that particular text in a little bit, but I'll include these titles in the OP for you. So let's kind of look at this discourse and what's happening here. Now, one of the things that Kobel and others have pointed out is that you have a shrinking audience in John 6. In John 6, you begin with these crowds, these multitudes, 5,000. And then it gets whittled down to a group in a synagogue. And then it gets whittled down even further when you get to the last part of the chapter where Jesus' words offend so many that they leave and he's just left with the 12. One of whom's going to betray him. I mean, so he's left with the 11. And, you begin to see this shrinking down because of what is being suggested here. And the fact is, the reality is, what is being suggested here is really abhorrent. It's the last thing that Christians want to think about when they come to this meal. And this is the beauty of this discourse, is it cuts us to the quick. It's perhaps as powerful or more powerful than the prologue. And the prologue, I think, is perhaps one of the most beautiful texts ever written, let alone the biblical in the Bible. So you begin. It says they find him. They say, Rabbi, when did you come here? Now, here's the response. There's the question. Jesus answered, I tell you most solemnly, you're not looking for me because you've seen the signs. That is what they're pointing to. But because you had all the bread you wanted to eat. You see me as the Deus ex machina, as the divine social worker, as the one who's just going to come and meet your needs. Do not work for food that cannot last. Well, what's he saying here? Do not work for food that cannot last. Be lazy? Obviously not. What's he saying here? Remember, the crowds see these semea, these signs, but they don't see them for what they are. They misinterpret these semea in a sense as dunamis, as miracles. And so they're looking to Jesus to be this miracle worker, this fixer, this Deus ex machina. But the writer of the fourth gospel, these are not just miracles, displays of power, which, again, Jesus isn't the only one in his culture to be able to have displays of power. There are many others, or at least several others that we know of, which suggest a plurality of others. This writer uses semea. These things are pointing to something. They're not just in and of themselves, like, poof, God is doing these great things. Even though God is doing these great things, nevertheless, they're pointing to something. And again, for this writer, what are they all pointing to? The death of Christ. All 7 signs lead up to the final sign, the death. And that's why the first sign, the fourth sign, are all about this blood. The second and the sixth sign are about resurrection. And the third and fifth sign are about the problem of the human condition. It cannot do anything to affect its own cure. And that's that chiastic structure. And it's built into what is going to be happening that will affect the human condition. And that's the gospel narrative, the passion of the Christ. And the telling of the story of the revelation of the Father and the Son and humanity's rejection of that message. Boom, there you have it. So, do not work for food that cannot last, but work for food that endures to, and I'm reading the Jerusalem Bible today. I particularly like the way they create strophes or verses of it. You see, it's not just prose text. You see that? I'm going to read this. It says eternal life. Again, I want you to think here, not in terms of Protestantism and, we live in time and then after that's eternity. No, we live in eternity. This is, there's an old debate. Let me just get you this. There's an old debate, and dear God, I hope I can remember where I'm at because I'm about to rabbit trail. Took place in and around the time of the Reformation, post-Reformation era, and it's a debate about whether or not the infinite, the finite, can contain the infinite. It has to do with the debate between the Lutherans and the Calvinists on the Eucharist. Because the Lutherans said, yes, the finite can contain the infinite. And that's how they get their in with under transubstantial consubstantial view of the Eucharist. Calvinists, on the other hand, tending to follow Zwingli, say no, the infinite, the eternal, cannot be contained in the finite. It can relate, but it can't be contained. So you have the phrases finitum capax infinity, the finite is capable of containing the infinite, and finitum non capax infinity, the finite is not able to contain the infinite. And those big debates, philosophical debates, of course, abstract debates, of course, but they influence all kinds of things theologically. And it takes Kierkegaard in the 19th century to turn the whole thing around and say, you guys are looking at this all wrong. The question is not whether the finite's capable or not capable of containing the infinite. The real question is, he says that it's the infinite is capable of containing the finite. And he flips the whole thing on its head. And this is what the Johannine writer is doing as well. He's going to bring us into a way of thinking that is absolutely outside the categories we're used to. Now, remembering two things. One, this writer has two audiences in mind when he's writing. He has his Jewish audience, and he is so familiar with Jewish traditions that he's able to dig deep into these traditions, and with just words and phrases and allusions, pull a richness to create a frame for interpreting the text. And we've seen that time and again, especially like with the prologue. But this writer also is very familiar with Greco-Roman culture. And as I pointed out using Andrew Lincoln's commentary in John 2, this writer is capable from the Logos forward to engaging Greco-Roman culture at the same time and Greek mythology at the same time. And that's also going on here in this discourse, okay? Because what we're going to do is we're going to move through this discourse about Jesus being this food, this bread. And he's going to say, you have to eat me. You have to eat me. You have to phage me. It's from the verb estio. It's an irregular aorist. And so don't think you got two different verbs here as though phagane is its own verb. No, it's just the aorist of estio, which means to eat or to dine. Estio also has another meaning. And thus the use of the aorist phagane. Here's what I suspect. This is a Johannine double meaning word. Because estio can mean both to eat, but it can mean to utterly consume, to devour. Now, when you think in terms of the bacchanalic rituals, the worship of Dionysius, and societies in the ancient world that engaged in cannibalism, groups and associations that would have engaged in human cannibalism, and there were, one has to think that the writer is also saying something here with reference to that. You see, and so it's no surprise when we come to a text like this that we're invited to think on with many pieces together. We're invited to think of the Moses, Exodus, manna tradition. Yes, that's a big piece of this. There are Passover themes here. Raymond Brown uses Eileen Gilding's earlier work in the 50s on her on the chronology and calendar in Qumran and the Fourth Gospel to show that the lectionary cycle, the 3-year lectionary cycle for the Passover, includes a number of texts from Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers that all have these echoes in the Fourth Gospel. Okay? Then if you really want to see something creative, I'm not sure quite how I buy it, but look at John Wick Bowman's book some 40 years ago on Esther and Purim as an influential festival that he sees all over the fourth gospel. I just have quite not followed that argument, but it's fascinating to read. Nevertheless, so in this discourse, as you move through it, you will notice that it's going to have a repetition. When you get to verse 51, you're going to get the repetition from verse 35. Verse 35, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never be hungry. He who believes in me will never thirst. Again, 51's now going to be the repetition of that, or the inclusio. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever, and the bread that I give is my flesh for the life of the world. Commentators again do note that the term here is not soma, it's not body. This is my body, this is my soma, as in the Eucharistic narratives of the Synoptics and Paul. This is my sarx. The word becomes sarx in John 1:14, flesh, the outer skin, the muscle, the tissue, you know. And that's one indication that we are to think in terms of not just simply the manna in the wilderness, the feeding of the 5,000, God providing lunch, so to speak. It's much, much deeper and richer than that. We are explicitly to think of eating human flesh and drinking human blood. Now, having said that, I want to observe something that Esther Kobel notes, again in her book in chapter 7. Excuse me. It's a fantastic book, by the way. It's called Dining with John. It's an excellent, excellent book. And she runs through, let me get back to my screen so I can see what I'm doing. She actually runs through all the references in ancient literature to the Bacchanalian rites and rituals, the community meals, and the various orgiastic types and associations and things that were influenced there. She observes a number of the explicit parallels between the mythologies of these gods, particularly Dionysius, the god of wine, and that festival that celebrates him, the Bacchanal, and what happens here in this narrative. And it's a marvelous, and she even traces this on into the early church and the accusations of cannibalism against the early Christians. And I just think this is powerfully significant, because the one thing you could never accuse Christians of when it comes to the Eucharist is cannibalism, because they've sanitized the whole thing. They've either hyper-spiritualized it, hyper-symbolized it, or sanitized it, okay, at the Eucharistic meal. And so Esther Kobel notes in her work, I'm going to read from her work now, quote, aside from the echoes to Eucharistic or Dionysian traditions that have been discussed in previous chapters, the graphic language in John 6:51-58 raises the uncomfortable possibility that the Johannine Jesus is inviting his listeners to engage in cannibalism. This is an interpretation, however, that very few commentators care to discuss, if they mention the idea at all. It is merely to dismiss the language as mere metaphors with no correspondence to real life. I would like to suggest, however, that the original audience would not necessarily have heard and understood this passage in an exclusively metaphorical manner. Rather, the original audience may well have heard in these words allusions to cannibalistic behavior in the literal sense. She's absolutely right. So when you go to peruse the commentaries, and I'm just going to take as an example, again, one of the finest commentaries on the Gospel of John ever written, Raymond Brown. Okay, 2-volume commentary, 1965, published a year after Peter Borgen's book in 64. Raymond Brown's 2-volume Roman Catholic commentary. Not a reference. Doesn't even come near it. Doesn't talk about cannibalism at all. I also want to quote from Reading the Bible with Rene Girard. And yeah, that's a picture of me and Rene and Steve Barry. We took that, Lori took that of us in Ottawa in, I think 2008 or so, when we were at the cover meeting. In the book, Steve says to Rene, it isn't explained to the people who are taking the bread and the cup by the preacher doesn't explain to them that this means the end of violence. When they participate in the Eucharist, it means the end of violence. And Rene says this: it means the end of violence, yet at the same time, it shows the continuity with a whole history of religion. So when anthropologists tell you, hey, that's cannibalism, that is the Eucharist, and when the anthropologists look at the church and they go, hey, that's cannibalism, you should answer, yes, of course. Cannibalism is part of human history, and the Eucharist summarizes it all in nonviolence. Rene says, therefore, why not cannibalism there as well in the Eucharist? Cannibalism is the essence of sacrifice. Cannibalism means you eat the sacrificial victim in order to be your victim, because you want to be that victim. The reason you killed him or her is you want to be him or her. So if you absorb their flesh, you become them. Just as if you absorb the flesh of Christ, you should become a little bit nonviolent, more than you were before. Wow, that's powerful stuff, people. You all know that this is the way I read the Eucharist in chapter 6 of my book, Mimetic Theory and Biblical Interpretation, and which is, really kind of a restatement of the Facebook posts, the 5 Facebook posts I've done on the Eucharist. So, again, one of the things that we want to recognize in this text and think through, because I need you to really think through this. I need you to stop and think about human cannibals. I need you to think about Jeffrey Dahmer. I need you to think about serial killers that consume or collect parts of their victims. I need you to think of the sickness, the disease, the dread, the fear, the anxiety, the absolute crushing of the human mind that must have occurred in order for a person or soul, in order for a person to be able to do that. And really, is it so much that we look at it that way, or is it that they are really just symbolic of who we are as a species? I mean, when you look back at the way Girard describes the origins of religion in human culture as this event that gets repeated until it structures us as human beings, and it begins to structure our brains and our relationships, and out of that develops culture and civilization, and you realize at the heart of all that is cannibalism. The slaughtering of victims in order to relieve the mimetic hostility in a community. Most of us have experienced this at one point or another in our lives. I mean, all of a sudden, bam, we were the person on the outs, and it's like, that really sucked. I didn't do anything. We all feel like Job, who is, of course, the anti-Oedipus. That's Job, but that's another rabbit trail. Okay, so you have in this discourse here, Jesus working this Jewish tradition, this manna tradition. And it's also going to deconstruct the entire human framework for being human as it gets back to the origins of what we are. We are the species that consumes ourselves. That's the human problem. I mean, there's an excellent book by Professor John Paul, Lutheran Girardian scholar, called Empire of Sacrifice. And in that book, he is able to show, without a shred of doubt, in the incredible and almost blind ways in America, we have learned to sacrifice youth, persons of color, the elderly, women, children, and we do it in our art, in all forms and manners of political and social construction. Empire of sacrifice. We have this whole sacrificial apparatus here, and it's being challenged by this Eucharistic narrative. You see, everything about us is being challenged at this point, because we're going to end up making one of two decisions. Because what you'll notice in this discourse as you move down to the end is that the verb trogein is going to be used. Estheo, phagein, the aorist, is switched out for trogein. And in the fourth gospel, trogein, to munch, is only used with reference to betrayal. Betrayal at meals. That's the 8th chapter in Kobel's book. But here, you have it used in John 6, and then a number of times, and then you have it used in John 13. The one who trogains my bread is the one who betrays me, Judas. You can eat this bread, and it will bring you damnation. The moment Judas takes the morsel, Satan enters in. That's the fourth gospel. Always diabolos in the fourth gospel until that point, and then it's the satanas. The mimetic principle enters in, as it were. He absolutely perceives Jesus as his model obstacle that must be gotten rid of. Trogein is to betray, to eat, to munch, to consume, to devour, but so is estheo. And that's what we do with our victims. We devour them, and we keep eating them over and over. And if you want just simple proof of this, go to your head. And when you have arguments with somebody, do you keep having arguments or hold grudges? And then you have arguments and you win every time? You're eating them, you're consuming them. But by allowing them into your head that way, it's all your perception anyway. But when you do that, they're consuming you as well. And you don't know it, and you think you're consuming them. We are a species that consumes. We consume through war. We consume through economics. We consume through politics. This whole discourse is about consuming the right thing. And so Jesus invites us to, I'm going to just invite you to note these things as you read this discourse today, rather than trying to actually exegete it verse for verse. I'm just going to invite you to get in there and allow this writer to shake you up. And I'm just trying to give you enough kind of background to do that. You will also notice in this discourse the connection of eschatology and Eucharist. Great title of Jeffrey Wainwright's book on eschatological themes in liturgical tradition, Eucharist and Eschatology. I think that was his doctoral dissertation. I'm not sure. Brilliant book. At any rate, eating this bread has to do with the last day, has to do with this final judgment. It has to do with everything, whether one is going to be in the light when consuming the bread, eating the bread of life, drinking the water that leads to no more thirst, or whether one is going to eat and drink damnation unto oneself. This, by the way, this theme of eating and drinking damnation that we see in 1 Corinthians, again, it's another connection, I think, and I wonder about, did the Apostle Paul derive this from the writer of the fourth gospel after he would have met that writer in the community of Ephesus? I'm collecting these things, as you know. So, the point is, in the Eucharistic meal, you are eating something. You're either eating the other, you're perceiving that God is the other, or you're eating yourself, or you're eating your neighbor. The only one that counts to eat in that meal is Jesus. It is his flesh that we're invited to eat. It is his blood we're invited to drink. I do want to note this. It is important to recognize in the Eucharistic meal the character of the blood. This cup is the new covenant in my blood shed for the forgiveness of sin. The cup is tied intimately to forgiveness. It is tied to certainly the Lucan saying on the cross, admittedly a textual variant. Nevertheless, I take it as historical. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. If we have learned to read this text properly through a good anthropological lens, through a solid theory of religion, what we have to note here is that the types of blood that can be drunk are three. There's the blood of myth. That's the blood the community drinks to solidify its belief that it's done the right thing in killing and eating the victim. This is the proper ritual. It's being done correctly. The gods want it. And whenever we sacrifice our youth and sending them off to war, or we say it's, for these kinds of reasons, and that's why we valorize them so greatly in the monuments, gave the supreme sacrifice kind of logic. There is the blood of vengeance, the cup of vengeance, blood as a cup of vengeance, Abel's blood. When you drink that blood in the Eucharist, what you're looking for is vengeance, and you're looking for God to provide it. If you can't provide it, you're looking for God to provide it, either here and now or eschatologically. And that's the blood of Abel. But the blood of Jesus is the blood of forgiveness. It's the blood of the forgiving victim. Okay? The major problem I have right now with Protestant Christianity is that it has evacuated that from the Eucharist. The way progressive and liberal Christianity has related to important social movements in America has been a difficult challenge for them. On the one hand, there is a seething and raging anger on the part of many, many, many groups that have a history, and Howard Zinn has pointed this out, of being oppressed basically by a white male hierarchical establishment. We get all that. That's just kind of the way it is. However, when Christianity, which claims that at its table shares in a cup that speaks a word of forgiveness, joins in a movement whose cup only speaks the blood of Abel, and those cups become confused, that Christianity is no longer speaking the gospel. And so on the one side, it wants to say, we believe in inclusion, we believe in forgiveness of all, we believe in dialogue, we believe in this, we believe in that. But on the other hand, it's aligning itself with a tactics, a strategy, and a politics, and a rhetoric of Abel. And Hebrews points out the blood of Jesus is superior to that of Abel, because anger will always lead to vengeance, the desire for vengeance. I mean, Shakespeare is the clearest exegete of this, and if you want exegesis of Shakespeare in that, go read Girard's A Theatre of Envy. The fourth gospel here is taking us into this world of the structuring foundations of human culture, the logos of Heraclitus, that this writer is directly addressing. The logos of Heraclitus is conflict, polemos, war, sacrifice. That's the context of the principle that structures reality and human thought, and it does. Heraclitus was correct. Hundreds of years before Jesus, he observes this. He doesn't have an alternative. There is no gospel yet. He's Greek, but he sees it. The audience dwindles because Jesus' humanity is emphasized more and more and more in this narrative, not simply in the use of the noun sarx, but the larger question of why is this guy telling us he's the bread that came from heaven? This is Joseph and Mary's boy. We know who he is. Why is he trying to tell us he came from God? That is, they're confused about his origin because he's human. Sound like a certain type of Protestant Christianity to you? Does to me. Jesus has to move on again to talk about his monogenes. Remember from John 1:18, Jesus is the monogenes, the unique Son. He has to talk about that relationship here in John 6 the same way he did in John 5, okay, where he says, nobody has seen the Father except the one who comes from God. He has seen the Father. I am the bread of life. I'm the one who will raise on the last day. And that's the problem. He's too human to be able to make these claims. So then in verse 52, you're going to get down to this. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Now, one of the intriguing things I found in Kobel's dissertation was her referencing a number of legends about Second Temple Jews who would capture a Gentile and in one form of the legend, put him in the temple and for a year feed him like a king and then secretly sacrifice him. And certain Antiochus meets him there. I suppose Antiochus Epiphanes or one of the Antiochenes meets him and says, what are you doing here? And the Gentile says, I'm a foreigner, and the Jews are going to fatten me up and kill me like they do every year. Can you rescue me, kind of thing. But the fascinating thing about this narrative, I can't imagine it's true, that the Jews somehow captured a foreigner every year and secretly sacrificed them in the temple. I think that's more anti-Semitic, ancient anti-Semitism than anything else. But fascinating connection. Here's this theme of kingship. They treat him like a king and then they sacrifice him. You see, that's the model there. That's that anthropological model of the divinization of the victim, demonization of the victim. But it gets reversed, of course, in the ritual process. Originally it's demonization, divinization, but through ritualization it becomes the obverse. First, the scapegoat is treated like a king for a season, and then they're sacrificed. In this text, the crowd wants to make Jesus king, and he recognizes he will be the sacrifice. Another powerful theme about the destructuring of empire in this text. Empire, Eucharist, ethics, eschatology, they're all right here, and they all connect and correlate. Do you see that? This is a powerful text. So as you move through reading this John 6 narrative, what you're going to continue to find as you move down through this, Jesus is saying, as you move toward the end, the synagogue hearers say, this is intolerable language. Now, I want to tell you a story about how intolerable this is. I've done this twice, but I want to tell you about the first time I did it, because it was totally spontaneous. I mean, completely spontaneous on my part. I'm at a house church in Birmingham, England. And this, I think, 2014, 13, 14, I don't know, remember when. Michael and Cheryl Nims, the leaders of the Anabaptist Network in the UK, and incredible people, had arranged this. So we're at this long wooden table, and for some reason, I suppose I had must have been editing the Girard book or something at the time. Because when they asked me to do a little communion reflection, there were, I don't know, 15 adults around this long table, and there was a loaf of bread there, and there was a cup of wine, kind of a goblet type of wine. And I imagine they thought they were going to get this, good reflection. So I'm talking about cannibalism. And the Eucharist and the bread. And I said, when we eat this, we come as persecutors. We hate Jesus. And if I was to use the language here in this video publicly on Facebook that I used that night with regard to Jesus and the bread, you would be shocked and appalled. Because what happened was there's also a big bread knife there on the table in front of me. And so as I'm talking about how we hate Jesus, we are the mob, we are the crowd, we hate everything he stands for. We just, the darkness shuns the light, it hates the light. And it's in us to hate him, it's in us to despise him, it's in us to react to this nonviolence BS and on. And I picked up the knife and I said, Jesus, you mother effer, and I stabbed the bread. I said, you stupid bat. And I'm just stabbing this bread and cursing Jesus for everything I'm worth. And then I put the knife down over by the next person and I passed the bread and I said, your turn. Well, most people passed on that. A few people took it and tried to do it kind of meekly. I hate you, I hate you. One person did it pretty vigorously, and by the time the bread got around to the end of the long table, it was still pretty intact, because you hadn't been that vigorously attacked. And I thought, isn't this fascinating? Here, Jesus says, take all your anger, hostility, bitterness, and rage against each other out on me. Hate me. And we won't do it because we love the Lord Jesus. We love Jesus. We come to church on Sunday and we love Jesus. There's no way we want to perceive what we're doing in that Eucharistic event as this. That's why, you get the Mass and the altar, they call it an altar in every church. They call it an altar. And is it not an altar, people? If it was an altar, it would be a bloody mess. We got white cloths and linens and gold chalices and this and that and the other, and we have little covers to cover things, and we've got little jars, and we've got little gold things to hold bread, and we got all kinds of fancy, but it's never a mess. And when we're done, we wrap it all up and clean it all up and boom, boom, boom. It's never a mess. There's never a sacrifice there. That's why it never occurs to us what we've done. And the need we have as a community to repent of this kind of behavior and the offer of forgiveness that then comes in the cup. The wine, the blood, the water, the Spirit that cleanse us and show us how we become a little more nonviolent each time we share in this community meal. Each time becoming more and more like the one we're consuming, Jesus. That is the Eucharist. That is not practiced in the church. There you have it. So, I invite you to look at John 6 through this lens. Now let's move to the end. Again, remembering, in the synoptic narratives after the feeding of the 5,000, something so disturbs Jesus that he flees to Gentile territory in Caesarea Philippi. And he goes, who do people think I am? And then they give him all these reasons. Yeah, they think John the Baptist, Elijah, this, that, and the other. And who do you think I am? Oh man, you're the Davidic Messiah. And Jesus has to go, shut up. Shut up. And then the dispute between Jesus and Peter when Jesus says, I'm going to tell you who I am. I'm the suffering true human. I'm going to suffer. This is it. No, Jesus, and get behind me, Satan. Now, in this discourse, after this incredible misunderstanding of Jesus as a deus ex machina, as a God out of a basket, as some kind of deliverance figure, as a giant social worker, man, come on. That's how Jesus is perceived to be, either historically in the liberal tradition. Jesus is kind of this social worker, goes around wanting to be a little Marxist here, and a little helpful there, and this kind of no. We have a sign, a Semaia. It's pointing to something, and that's this whole new way of doing human community, and that is what this text is about. The whole fourth gospel is about a whole new way of doing community, or what many refer to as doing beloved community. You see, reading this text, it will read you. Well, I'm at 45 minutes. I hope you've had a good romp today. Let me just say hi to everybody that's joined. I didn't have a chance to look over at the comments. But we will begin chapter 7 next week. Again, remember, we're in a courtroom. There are witnesses being called. The Semea, the signs are the witnesses, and they're pointing to this great sign, the undoing of the way we think about our relation to violence, rivalry, bitterness, faula, being mean to one another, practicing meanness, hurting one another, accusing one another. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't dot this I, you didn't cross this T, you didn't utter that shibboleth. You disagree with me here. That's all practicing faula. Okay? Hey, Chris, you're quite welcome. We want to be children of the light. We want to be those that eat the bread of life, drink the water of life. Those who are given the authority, the exousia, to become children of the Papa, as Jesus, the light of the world, as Jesus. So that we too are the bread of life. We go out, the world consumes us. How does it consume us? It cannibalizes us. And we forgive. Would that Christianity recognized that it exists only to be eaten and only to forgive. Cheers.